respected members of the ulama, brothers and sisters, our guest speakers, Professor Sean Davison, Professor Abdul Fadl Mohsin Ibrahim, and Attorney Wahid Parker, those listening to us via live streaming on the internet, members and audiences of ETV, I greet you with the universal greeting of love and peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of the imams, the trustees, as well as the executive committee, it gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to one and all to the Masjidul Quds Institute. Thank you to our speakers for accepting our invitation. Your presence here today is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. The topic chosen for this year's annual Ramadan symposium is euthanasia, a word which originates from Greek origins, which essentially means a good death. Described in the dictionary as the practice of ending a person's life in order to relieve pain and suffering. In a nutshell, that's what euthanasia is about, according to the dictionary. Euthanasia also sometimes is being referred to as assisted dying, mercy killing, and assisted suicide. These are very, very powerful words to describe a highly emotive subject, a very sensitive topic with individual emotions and tempers at stake, and a huge amount of ethical considerations to take into account when discussing this topic. More than ever before, we hear of terminally ill patients suffering with a tremendous amount of pain and discomfort who are now requesting for their lives to be terminated. We often hear them saying that the pain and discomfort is too much to bear. Today we will try to unravel some of the ethical and moral concerns surrounding this topic. Who could possibly decide on a person's right to die? Heated debate continues to occur on the topic of euthanasia between those who advocate for it to be legalized and those who oppose it. This afternoon we hope to explore some of the legal, religious, and medical aspects of euthanasia. Should the right to life include the right to die? I just want to bring to your attention that the masjid does not have all the answers. We are merely providing the platform to discuss topics which affect us on a daily basis. Some of the topics we've not heard about 20 years ago, some of the topics we hear about now. It is for you to come and listen to the presentations and for you to also then study the fiqh and the jurisprudence that our alims will give you, and then to make up your mind from there based on what the fatwas is about. At this point in time, I'd like to call upon the Honorable Sheikh Alexander to render an opening dua, please.
Dearly beloved, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Before we render the opening dua, I would like you to spare a thought for our Palestinian brothers and sisters. At the moment, Palestine is bleeding. Palestinian people are faced with atrocities being committed against them, and are faced with great humiliation. We pray to Almighty God, Allah, for His divine intervention, and we pray for world peace. Kindly all together join me in reading Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Alexander, for that. Gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, we are about to really get into the details of the discussion now. I'd like to call upon Dr. Baude to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Mr. MC, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Mr. MC, please allow me to acknowledge Mr. Sattar Parker, whose idea was to have this talk, this seminar here today. It was his brainchild. Thank you, Sattar Bhai, for stimulating debate on issues that affect, for which Islam should have an answer. I was given the task of choosing the panel today, and I'm sure you'll be happy with what we've managed to find. Our first speaker is Professor Sean Davison. He is now a South African citizen. He first came from New Zealand in 1991. He took up the academic post at the University of the Western Cape, where he's currently a professor in the Department of Biotechnology, and he heads the Department of Forensic DNA, the laboratory that does that. In 2009, Professor Davidson published a book which was entitled Before We Say Goodbye, which described the 3 months he spent with his late mother in New Zealand before she died. As a consequence of what he wrote, he was arrested and put on trial in New Zealand for attempted murder of his mother. During his High Court trial in November 2011, he was offered a lesser charge, which he accepted. And the charge was then turned to assisted suicide. He pleaded guilty to that charge, and he was under house arrest for 5 months in Dunedin, New Zealand. His trial ignited a lot of debate on voluntary euthanasia in South Africa and in New Zealand. In 2011, while he was awaiting his trial, he founded the organization of Dignity South Africa, possibly you might tell us about it, which seeks to change the law in South Africa to allow for assisted dying of terminally ill people. So let us hear of his experiences and his views on ethics of euthanasia. We present to you Professor Sean Davison.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a few house rules. Our speakers will be speaking for 15 minutes. If you have any questions, we have pads that go around, especially the ladies if you want to ask your questions. We have a roving mic here as well. We'll have all the speakers do their presentation, and then we'll have the questions afterwards. Right, thank you.
Thank you for that welcome. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. I am not a Muslim, but I've always had the greatest respect, admiration for the Islamic faith and values. It really is a privilege to be here. I've also had the greatest respect for the claims to Palestine. On a lighter note, I haven't always been aware of the traditions in a mosque, and when I put on my socks this morning, I did not know that I would be taking off my shoes. I found a lot of people have been watching my red socks. I would have had a very neutral, bland, plain colour if I was aware of that. I'll blame my wife. Today's subject does sound very sombre, serious. We're talking about the issues around death and dying, but it doesn't have to be so sombre. We're all going to die. No one in this room is exempt. It is an issue we should talk about, and the more we talk about it, the more we will be prepared for our own deaths and those of our family members. So let's embrace the discussion. I will be talking about the circumstances of my mother's death, but in doing that, I acknowledge that many others have very similar stories and much more tragic stories than my own. I only talk about my own because I'm very familiar with it, and I feel it highlights the same issues that other people are dealing with. But it is certainly not a unique story. I'd like to begin by highlighting a story from England last year about Tony Nicholson, this gentleman here. He had a massive stroke, a stem brain stroke, that left him completely paralysed. The only part of his body he could move was his eyelids. Here he is, describing it with, in the news, this anguished expression, describing it as the closest thing to being buried alive. Prior to his stroke, here he is with his family, a healthy man of middle-aged, no signs of anything coming, no poor health. At this point, he went to a conference in Greece, in Athens, where he had this massive stroke. He lay in a hospital bed in Athens for 1 month before his wife realised that he was trying to communicate by blinking. She was able to hold up the alphabet, and he would blink, indicating which letter he wanted her to select. His first words were not, "I love you," or "How are the children?" His first words were, "I want to die." Can you imagine lying there, unable to move, people not even knowing your brain was functioning? He then set about campaigning to have the right to die. He certainly couldn't take his own life. He had no ability to do that. Here he is with his daughters in the hospital. He went to the High Court in England, and eventually the highest court in the land ruled that voluntary euthanasia is murder. He could not have assistance to die. Fortunately, a week after that, he died, probably from an assisted death, and certainly due to the huge public support he had in England, no one would dare prosecute his case. He had so much support, it probably would have brought down the English government if they tried to prosecute those who helped him to die. Here he is, this terrible face that was published all over the world, anguished expression, after the court ruled he could not die. It's a bit haunting, but the next stroke could happen to you or to me. We don't know who it's going to happen to next. We need to be prepared for the consequences of such a stroke. As I said, we all have a story to tell. Let me share my story with you. You may have heard snippets of it in the newspapers or on TV. I'd rather you hear it from my lips before you pass comment or even pass judgment. First of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my mother. I think to most people, she's just a mother who asked her son to help her to die. But to me, she's my mother, who I love very much. I'd like you to see a little bit of the real person behind this lady. Here she is, aged 13 and about 23. She was born in Istanbul, Turkey. She wasn't an Arab. Her father was a correspondent for Reuters, and they travelled the world. And my mother was educated all over the world. She's an only child. Eventually, she obtained a physics degree at London University and a medical degree at Belfast, Queen's University. There she met my father. They're both Irish, and they settled in New Zealand. And along came the family. I'm the baby on the knee there. This is where I developed my love for dogs at a very early age. We stayed in New Zealand. My mother loved New Zealand, discovered her love of arts, painting, sculpture. She was a very compassionate woman. She loved travelling. Here we are many decades later, celebrating her 80th birthday in Kathmandu, Nepal. I was 40 and my brother in the middle, 50. The decades went by. My mother was eventually widowed, and she chose to settle in a tiny place called Broad Bay, just outside Dunedin. Those of you who follow rugby will know Dunedin as the House of Pain, often for Springboks. Of course, my mother knew nothing about rugby. She had a wonderful house. This is a view from her bedroom window. She was in her 80s, and she had chosen to die at home. And I respect anyone who makes such a request or decision, surrounded by the things you love and the people you love. Here's her cat, the cat she loved. Eventually, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And this is when I went to New Zealand to be with her at the end. It was going to be a sad occasion, but not a tragic occasion. Death is only tragic if you haven't lived a full life. My mother had lived a full and colourful life. So in many ways, I was going there to celebrate her life in her death. When I got there, her health did steadily deteriorate. She lost the ability to walk easily. She'd lost the ability to read, to hold a paintbrush. She loved to paint. She lost the ability to taste food. She said it all tasted metallic. And we know the joy of tasting food. My mother was a medical doctor. She knew the terrible death awaiting her from secondary cancer. So she made the decision to go on a hunger strike, in many ways bringing her death into her own hands. If you stop eating, there's only one possible outcome. You die. And she was a medical doctor. We respected her decision because she was a doctor. We assumed she knew what she was talking about. And of course, she was our mother, and you always listen to your mother. She wrote a living will in a scrawled doctor's handwriting, requesting she not be forced to eat, and not be forced to take medication, and not be taken to hospital. We all agreed with that request. At that time, I was her sole caregiver when her hunger strike started. She thought she would die very quickly because she'd eaten very little in the weeks before this. But instead, the days went by and the weeks went by. And after 5 weeks of drinking only a glass of water each day, she was unable to move her arms or her legs. Her flesh was virtually rotting on her body. If I touched her to turn her, her skin was bruising. She was now having the dreadful death that she went on a hunger strike to avoid. It was a terrible, terrible death. At this point, she made the request for me to help her to die. She was now incapable of ending her life. She'd gone on a hunger strike and it hadn't worked. A very difficult request for a mother to make to a son, and a very difficult request for a son to receive from a mother he loved very much. After I thought about it, I realised there was no decision to make. Who was I to say that my mother must continue to rot in her bed when she was begging to die? There was no decision to make. It was what my mother wanted. I'm sure you have many questions around this, which I'm happy to answer later, but I can assure you every question that you could ask, I could answer, and my mother could answer at that time. Here was her funeral where her artist friends painted her coffin prior to the funeral. The consequences of writing a book was that I was charged with the attempted murder of my mother. A book that was initially just a diary. My sister in New Zealand insisted I publish it. She had worked as a social worker and said she'd come across many people who had been in similar situations. And she said, by sharing my story, they would know they're not alone. Following the publication of my book came the judgment in the High Court in Dunedin, where after a complicated trial, I accepted a charge of assisted suicide and served a 5-month house arrest sentence. House arrest in New Zealand is where you have an ankle bracelet attached to your ankle permanently, wired to an electronic modem, so that if you leave the premises, an alarm goes off at the police and they come running. We don't have this in South Africa. My sentence could have been a lot worse. Fortunately, the only previous case in New Zealand was a lady who received a 2-year jail sentence for the same alleged crime. She did 9 months before being released on parole. Fortunately, Desmond Tutu kindly wrote to the judge requesting leniency, and I don't think any court in the world would have sent me to jail if they'd received a letter from Archbishop Tutu, so I was very grateful to him. I'm going to skip over some of these other issues which will come up later. There's not very much time. I was going to talk about other countries where the law has changed. Rather, move straight to the issue of Dignity South Africa, the organisation I founded, which seeks a law change in South Africa to allow for assisted suicide. Here you see our 5-member executive, headed in the middle by Mohammed Faisal. He's a devout Muslim and a medical doctor. He will be the man that takes this bill to Parliament. We're very grateful to have him. I think you may know him already. The criteria for the law change we're seeking, here they are. First of all, it has to be an individual's free choice. Free choice marks a hallmark of our humanity. Secondly, the person has to be terminally ill. This is why we call it assisted dying. The person is dying already. They have a prognosis of about 6 months. It is not an assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is for a person who is not dying. This is assisted dying. Thirdly, they need to be in a sane state of mind. Fourthly, an independent panel will assess these conditions have been met. The panel will perhaps be their GP and their oncologist. Finally, should their request be approved, there will be a 14-day cooling off period before the medication is taken to them to end their lives. You may say, why change the law when a person can end their life at any time? The reason is that suicides can go horribly wrong. You can end up in a much worse condition than prior to this. Often people take violent means such as hanging, shooting, cutting of arteries. That is no way to end a dignified life. This is why we need the law changed. There are other issues around doctors which will come up later. But my time is up. I wanted to conclude with a very good friend of mine, Dr. Anrik Berger, left a quadriplegic from a car accident. A quadriplegic is totally incapable of ending their own life. A terminally ill person can, by some of these terrible means. I feel a law change should also include people who are quadriplegics. I'm speaking from my own point of view. The organisation Dignity SA is only requesting a law change for the terminally ill. My personal view is it should go beyond that. But again, you can express your opinion and we can talk about it later. Dr. Anrik Berger did not get the support of his family, but found his own way of an assisted death in December last year. The next car accident could happen to you, or to me. We have to be prepared for these terrible events. Finally, old age could happen to you and to me. Many of us are going to get there if we live a natural life. Surely in a civilized society, a person who is near the end and possibly facing an undignified death can say, no thank you, I've had enough, I want to die with dignity. There are going to be people who end up in the same position as me. There are going to be people who end up in the same position as my mother. It is time this suffering ended. This is a challenge to the whole human race. I believe it is one of the greatest challenges to our humanity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Davison. There's some papers going around. You can send your questions up in the meantime, so you can get them in first. Our next speaker, can I also welcome all my colleagues I see here. Our next speaker is Mr. Wahid Parker. Mr. Parker is an attorney, notary, conveyancer of the High Court. He lectures in contracts at the Department of Legal Education in the Law Society of South Africa, formerly a district and a regional magistrate. He's the examiner for the Law Society, currently practicing for his own account as Parker's Incorporated, and he specializes in conveyancing and commerce. He's spoken to us in the past, last year. He spoke to us on organ transplantation, and he did very good research for it from the legal aspect. So it is an honor to have him back with us again to talk on the current legal aspects of euthanasia. Mr. Wahid Parker.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ما كان محمد أبا أحد من رجالكم ولكن رسول الله وخاتم النبي وكان الله بكل شيء عليما إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وأصحابه وبارك وسلم. Brothers and sisters in Islam, honored guests, I greet you in Allah's name. I greet you with a universal greeting that addresses the heavens and the earth, the inanimate and the animate. I greet you in Allah's name. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, we can start off by saying that euthanasia in and of itself is not legal and not lawful in South Africa. It is furthermore compounded with the issue as follows, that there is no legislation dealing particularly with euthanasia or assisted dying or any issue related or relative to that. You will have to go to what is called concomitant legislation like the Constitution, legislation like the bill currently before, well, the intended bill before Parliament, which is the End of Life Decisions Act. I think Professor Davidson will be able to speak more about that. And there is nothing except the case law, which I will deal with as we go along. So at present, the position in our law is that the termination of a person's life is unlawful, even if the motive for such conduct is to end the person's unbearable suffering, and even where the suffering person has expressed the wish to die or has even begged to be killed. So it is an absolute that you may not assist even a person, or a person may not ask to be released of the pain or for his life to be ended. In 1990, this issue was addressed by the South African Law Commission, and sadly to say, the Law Commission wasn't able to come up with much. It was during the presidency of President Nelson Mandela that the Law Commission then was mandated to determine the issue as to whether euthanasia should be legalized in South Africa. I may just add that in the following countries, that is Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Switzerland, there is the possibility of being, under certain circumstances, of ending your life, as long as it is physician-mediated euthanasia, including physician-assisted suicide. I can't see my own slide, but I suppose it is up there. No, you see, we go back and see it. Okay, it's all right. Okay. From a moral, legal, and ethical dimension, the euthanasia debate has to do with the balance of competing rights which are constitutionally guaranteed and which include the right to life, the right to freedom, the right to security, the right to privacy, and the right to autonomy and dignity. Now, these competing rights are those rights which further makes the issue far more complex than what it seems. Because if you speak of the right to life, and it is something I will address later on, it is very easy for the government to say that you shall not take your own life. Now, I do not want to cause a debate here, and neither do I want to prolong my submissions, but you only have to look at the issue of abortion. If you speak of the one hand of the right to life, on the other hand, when does life come into being, and yet you allow that life to be taken? I just put it out there. Those arguing against euthanasia argue that the prohibition of international killing or causation of death is the cornerstone of law and social relationships. That is so. If we do not have law, we can't function as a society. However, many of you will remember the case of Subramani in the KwaZulu-Natal division. What had happened there was this person was, if he had not received a dialysis, he would have died, because there was a malfunctioning of his kidney to the extent where there was no qualitative life value for him when it came to the issue of living. And he then said to the government, essentially, if you speak of life, then give me access to good health. And that was the dichotomy, or the argument before and against. You can't tell a person, or I'm just saying to you what the argument was. Can't tell a person, you can't take your life, and then tell the person also, well, I can't help you really but die. That's a contradiction. That's a contradiction. I simply raise it, and whilst Subramani was not particular to the point, I'm simply extracting the principle. Those in favor that the right to life is, those in favor of euthanasia argue that the right to life is not merely a biological life, but a life, an entitlement and a claim to a particular quality of life. And this ties in with the state versus, or the matter of Subramani versus the Minister of Health. You can't tell a person that you shall live and then deny that person by virtue of a budget the right to a quality life. Now understand one thing, I am simply presenting the law here. Do not construe this as my judgment or my values. I'm simply presenting how the law obtains at present. Now the difficulty that certain people raise is that in South Africa, with its severe constraints on the healthcare facilities and its totally inadequate resources for a highly effective medical treatment, there's a real risk of euthanasia becoming a substitute for proper care for the terminally ill and the other patients in dire medical straits. What does that mean? It simply means that if you're going to legalize euthanasia, again, please, this is a complex topic. Understand what I'm saying in the context of what I am saying. So you could possibly find a person then say, you know what? He must now just a cabbage. Let him go. And you would find yourself in that conundrum where the law is then assisting people to essentially tell people or to assist people in just dying, where the flimsiest request can be made by a person. Obviously, the submission made by Professor Davidson is a very important submission that there must be a control and a process. So until the time, or until it arises that what Professor Davidson has submitted here comes to the fore with regards to legislation, then perhaps this argument can be negated. Now, our criminal law is not consistent in dealing with ethical issues. And I'll give you an example. Criminal law prohibits cruelty to animals. You try and flog a horse and you see what happened to you. Try and flog a cow or any animal, and quite rightly so, you can't be cruel to animals. But have you seen the horrendous conditions under which the hens that we eat every day, they live? Or even the animals, how they are slaughtered. And perhaps we can even take it further. Witness sometimes how even some of us perform qurbani. In the pursuit of an ideal of pleasing Allah, we displease Him by not taking into account the ethical considerations as regards His creation, which is the sheep that we slaughter. In Hurst versus Clark, a High Court decision, the wife of a patient who was in a permanent vegetative state sought an order authorizing her to withhold the intravenous feeding so that he could starve to death. The court held that whilst he was strictly speaking still alive, there was no possibility that he would emerge from this state, and that his brain had permanently lost the capacity to induce a physical and mental existence at the level which qualifies as human life. So, I alluded earlier on to the fact that there is no legislation as such, and the courts always have to intervene because there is this gap or this lacuna or this absence of legislation which can guide a person as to whether euthanasia is permissible or not. Now, I go back to that case, and I want to say to you that there's a degree of ambivalence in this judgment. In other words, what I mean by it is, it simply looks at the issue in a very narrow, constricted manner. Okay, is he capable of living? Okay, he's not capable of living. Okay, then he must die. Now, the question that is then asked by the ethicists and the persons who have the moral standpoint is this. Is there a difference between a person who is never going to recover and a person who is under so much pain with no chance of it abating, and him being continuously fed morphine in huge amounts? At what stage does this morphine dosage amount to euthanasia? So you could find yourself in a situation where, on the one hand, the order is granted, but on the other hand, because you are in so much pain, in other words, there is no return for you, but the pain that you endure is such that it truly negates the very foundation of your existence. But because you are aware, the court says, the law says, no, but you can't make a decision, sorry. You can say, yeah, but I am beyond what is happening. And I allude here to the analogy, or rather the case of Professor Davidson's mother. In State versus Hartman, the father of the accused suffered untreatably and progressively from cancer in his prostate. He was in great pain and he was given large doses of morphine. His son was in charge with murder under the dolus eventual concept. Dolus eventualis simply means it's the indirect causing of death of another human being. The court found him guilty and said even though he was compassionate, it still amounts to murder. And then the court said that they are going to sentence him, which they did, but the sentence was symbolic. He was sentenced to 5 minutes in jail in the sense that he was in court, and when the court adjourned, he was a free man again. Okay, quickly, passive euthanasia is the withholding of medical treatment with the deliberate intention of causing the person's death. This ranges from a family decision to switch off a life support or to a person's decision not to continue chemotherapy sessions. Active euthanasia is taking specific steps to cause the person's death. An example would be an overdose dosage. In other words, passive euthanasia, you do nothing. Active euthanasia, you do something. It is still illegal in South Africa. You can, as an individual, as Professor Davidson has said, refuse medical treatment. The difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide is that in the latter, it relates to a provision and not administration. And I give an example here. If you are given morphine by a doctor, that would be part of the administration. But if the doctor were to put the syringe there and say to you, Chief, here, it is loaded, but you decide. That would then amount to assisted suicide. Now, just bear in mind, it is both illegal. Differences between a living will, euthanasia, and palliative care. I'm almost done, Mr. Reker. A living will is simply a document which is a directive beforehand. There is no settled law in our country as to whether that is legal. I can tell you from my understanding of the law, it is not a valid will. It's not a will in the true sense of the word. Palliative care relates to the care of terminally ill patients where health cannot be restored, and that is the doctors can tell you, where there is just the last days of life. They are taken to hospice or whatever, or some analogous institution, and they are then given the medical care. That's the sources that I had in obtaining this research, and yeah, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Our next speaker, we are fortunate in having Professor Abul Fadl Mohsin Ibrahim in having accepted our invitation. He comes from the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's written extensively on Islamic jurisprudential issues. Interestingly, he's also written on the other end of life, the beginning of life, the ethics of fertility treatment. Possibly that could be our discussion for next year. He's lectured in 38 different countries, including Argentina, Australia, Uzbekistan, Zambia. He was born in the Seychelles. He then went to the Alimia Institute in Pakistan, went to the Al-Azhar. Then he went to Temple University, Philadelphia in the USA, and then where he obtained his PhD. He's got many areas of specialization, including Islamic law and bioethics. He reads, writes, speaks 5 different languages: Urdu, French, English, Creole, Arabic. He's written on death and dying, co-authored many articles, books on it, and involved in bioethics seminars on organ transplantation, sexual morality in Islam, family planning, amongst other things. Today he will touch on the realities of dying and what death brings to us. He will touch on the fact, and we've heard it being said to us, that dying is a process and death is an event. Dying is a process, death is an event. We will now call on Professor Abul Fadl Mohsin Ibrahim from Natal to come and talk to us.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil mursalin Sayyidina wa Nabiyina Maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa ba'd. First of all, I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for having brought me safely to your beautiful city. And secondly, I wish to thank the Masjid committee for having extended the invitation to me. And I'm really honored to be here with all of you. Members of the panel, Imam Alexander, sisters and brothers in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When we talk about death and dying, we have to understand, as Dr. Baradi has mentioned, that death is an event and dying is a process. Now, all of us, by virtue of having been born, are in the process of dying. But we do not know when death will come. And we have heard from Professor Davison how agonizing it was for the mother to wait for death. And death never came. And yet, as Imam Alexander reminded us today about the Palestinians who are being killed, they do not want to die. And they are just dying. So life is intriguing. And this is what I want to try and share with you to understand who controls life and who controls death. Now, when you received the pamphlet, it talked about the principles of palliative care. So I won't labor a lot on that, but I want you to just look at bullet number 2, which means neither hastens nor postpones death. So palliative care, when you're caring for the death, for the dying, then you should not actually hasten death nor postpone death. Perhaps we'll understand that better later on. And also it was mentioned there about homicide. So it's the killing of one human being by another human being. So now when we come back to the two realities, and then who controls life and who controls death, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Imran, every soul shall taste death. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also makes it very clear to us, wherever you are, death will find you, even if you are in towers built up strong and high. So no one can actually escape from death. All of us have to die. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala very clearly tells us, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وَكُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ. You know, everything that is in this world will perish. But only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be eternal and everlasting. Now, when you're talking about the process of dying, you know, some of us may have a car accident, Professor Davison mentioned, and we may have head injuries, be paralyzed, or we may have an illness like cancer. And then how do we as Muslims look at that? We look at that not as a curse, not as a defect in our iman, but rather as a trial from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is an expiation for our sins. Remember, we are all insan. We all make mistakes. We are all sinners. وَكُلُّ بَنِي آدَمْ خَطَّاءٌ وَخَيْرُ الْخَطَّائِينَ التَّوَّابُونَ. All the children of Adam are sinners, but the best of sinners are those who repent. And in this hadith, Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ says, never is a believer stricken with discomfort, hardship, grief, or even mental anguish that his sins are not forgiven. So death comes as an instruction for us. When we see death, and I'm sure Professor Davison, looking at death in front of him, you know, and he told us when he spoke that, you know, that we all have to be ready for death. It's a reminder that we too have an appointment with death, an instruction for us to mend our ways, surrender ourselves to Allah before whom all of us have to render accounts of our deeds. And then when someone passes away, we do not offer condolences to that person, but rather the very first thing that we say is Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We remind ourselves that to Allah we belong and unto Him is our return. Now we come to the issue of euthanasia. And euthanasia, it has been explained, but I just don't to deal too long on it. I'll just say it's mercy killing of the hopelessly ill, death by administering drugs to withhold or withdraw patient from life support so as to hasten death, administering patient with a lethal injection, termination of the terminally ill's life, so that we assist dying. An active euthanasia, deliberate act undertaken to end the life of the patient with or without his or her consent. And then we have an ayah of the Quran here which says, and do not take any human being's life, the life which Allah has willed to be sacred, other than the pursuit of justice. So death is actually the prerogative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah says, and no person can die except by Allah's leave and at an appointed term. Now, I just want to draw your attention to what Professor Davison told us. And the mother thought that by starving herself, then she would die. But it never happened. It never happened. With a glass of water, but as he explained, what happened, you know, saw the mother just in a lot of pain, perhaps, and also seeing her wasting away. All right? But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala terms death as ajal. It will happen only at that particular time. All right? It is decreed by Allah when, so even if someone assists you, then it will happen at when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees that it should happen. And then we have a question, another look at voluntary euthanasia. Experiencing extreme pain, the patient requests for his or her life to be terminated. Suicide, whether assisted or self-inflicted, is a crime according to Sharia. Allah says in the Quran, do not kill yourselves, for Allah has been to you most merciful. And then also we have a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ tells us about a man before our time, before the Islamic era. There was a man before your time who was wounded, The pain became unbearable, and he took a knife and cut off his hand. Blood began to pour out profusely, leading to his death. Allah said, "My servant has hastened himself to me, so I made paradise forbidden for him." Now we go now to a philosophical understanding of the concept of pain and suffering. There's a transcendental dimension. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala posed a question. He said, do people think that they would be left alone upon saying we believe? So affliction with a disease, fatal or otherwise, should be viewed as a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a beautiful hadith, and I want you to just ponder over it. When a Muslim is afflicted with a disease, it is said to the angel, write down for him the good actions which he used to engage in. If he, Allah, cures him, he, Allah, absolves him of all sins. But if he, Allah, chooses to take his life as a result of this disease, he, Allah, forgives him and shows mercy upon him. And then we have the last one, that is passive euthanasia. So when you look at from the Islamic point of view, the most tolerable would be what is termed as passive euthanasia. Not to resuscitate the patient, to allow death to take its natural course. Treatment may be discontinued on the advice of Ahlul Khibra, medical experts, that there is little hope for the patient's recovery. So even if any Muslim is diagnosed with cancer and say, I do not want to have chemotherapy, you are within your rights not to have chemotherapy. And also if someone has a heart attack, and also they say, the relatives around say, do not resuscitate the patient, then it is within his rights too. Even medication, I do not want to take the medication, he has all the right to do so. I don't know whether you read about Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, when they kept pouring, during his last days, pouring medicine in his mouth, he used to push it away. So patients have a right to refuse treatment. The conclusion, therefore, is when, and that is the question that was posed in the pamphlet, when a doctor is accused of sparing a dying patient of intense pain, is it palliative care or homicide? The answer in terms of the Sharia would be that it is homicide. And I would like now to draw your attention to a beautiful hadith. We as Muslims are not allowed to make dua or supplicate for death. But look at what Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ says. He says, prayer for death, he terms it as makruh, disliked. But he says you should make this type of dua. None of you should pray for death as a result of a calamity which befalls him. But if he has to wish for death, let him say, O Allah, keep me alive as long as life is good for me, and cause me to die when death is better for me. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله إن الله الغفور الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you very much to our guest speakers for presenting the very sensitive and extremely complex topic of euthanasia in such an interesting and an informative manner. We've only given you 15 minutes each to discuss this very complex topic. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the interesting part of the symposium. The way we're going to do this is we have a roving mic upstairs for the ladies, and we have a mic here on the floor for the gentlemen. I have a few written questions which we can start with, but if there's anybody now in the audience that wish to present a question, please indicate who you're directing your question to and keep it as short and simple. Thank you. Please, here's a roving mic. Please indicate who your question is directed to. Thank you.
My question, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
It's on.
Okay, my question is directed to Attorney Wahid Parker. I see in law school I learned quite a few cases. All the cases are about Christian Lawyers Association, which is that and that and that. But I haven't even heard a single case against Muslim Lawyers Association, against Department of Health, or Department of Education, or anything, any submission like this.
Can you just clarify your question in one sentence?
Okay, the question is, I haven't heard any submissions from our Muslim Lawyers Association against any, means against the Constitution or against any of the departments.
Thank you.
The difficulty is that I'm not aware of a Muslim Lawyers Association. They are dealing specifically with this topic. So, yeah, as much as I may have my views, look, in and of itself, euthanasia in South African law with a Christian narrative is a difficult and complex matter. On the Islamic front, from a Muslim perspective, this matter, there have been submissions by Muslim lawyers with regards to the marriage bill, the Matrimonial Property Act, but on this issue, I am not aware of any submissions. Okay, thank you.
Right, do we have another question? Attorney Mahmoud Khatib, please come to the front. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And once again, I'd like to say shukran to the speakers for delivering a beautiful presentation, and also a very special welcome to my teacher, Sheikh Abul Fadl Mahsin Ibrahim, who I studied under at UDW. One of the things I'd like to ask Dr. Davison is that the problem one faces with is, especially in a society of ours, that we have really major challenges in terms of medical care and the availability of resources. It creates many dilemmas. One of the dilemmas is that it may be easier for people to decide that assisted suicide or euthanasia because of the lack of resources, which sends out a very negative message that it may be better to be, it creates a negative message for those who are sick and disabled, that it may be better for them to die. Then there's the whole concept of the slippery slope argument, and that depending on whether euthanasia, if allowed, it can easily spiral into uncontrolled assisted suicide. The third component is that there is a whole concept of people who are sick and disabled. If they don't have palliative care, emotional, social, spiritual care and well-being, they sometimes are not in the best of position to make proper decisions with regards to their own health. Also the other concept of the diagnosis of the doctor may be wrong. And especially in a society where we are very much enjoined by me, myself and I, and each one becomes selfish, it then becomes very easy for family members of sick or disabled patients to choose the easier way out and say, we'd rather have you killed or have you dead than spend any more of my selfish time looking after you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, or many questions. If you look at Oregon, the state in America, which has the law that we're looking at replicating, assisted dying, there the number of people who've requested that has been the same, has been steady year after year after year. There's been no rapid increase, people being pushed into it. In addition, a very, very illuminating statistic: 40% of the people who've been approved in assisted death do not take up that option. These are people with a 6 months prognosis. They're going to die soon. 40% do not take it up, do not take the medication. The implication is all they want is the security of knowing they can have an assisted death if they want it. If they're desperate, they can have it. So they apply for it and it's approved. My mother would not have gone on a hunger strike if she knew she could take this medication anytime she wanted to, and she probably would have died naturally. Very often the elderly are desperate to die. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine when we're so alive and enjoying life. But when you've lived a full life and you are suffering, I emphasize the suffering at the end, great pain, palliative care doesn't always ease that suffering. You are desperate to die. To have that knowledge that you have that option gives you so much peace of mind. All we're seeking is to change the law to have that option available. And finally, the issue of pressure from the family, or the slippery slope. As one of those criteria I mentioned, one is the independent panel. The independent panel will confirm, or try to confirm, that there's no family pressure and that the person is of a sane state of mind. The gentleman mentioned maybe the person is not in a sane state of mind. The criteria will be very tightly, very precisely defined. I hope that addresses some of the questions.
Thank you. Prof. Ibrahim, I think this one we can direct at you. If euthanasia is not legal in South Africa, why does doctors ask the families to switch off the support of the loved ones? Is this not a type of assisted death?
It's a good question. All right, what happens is that when you look at the Islamic law, the Sharia, to put someone on extraordinary means of, to sustain the life is not fard. Is not fard. So you have the option to make that request. All right, that I don't want to be, like you say, the living will, I think it was mentioned here. As Muslims, we can make a living will and say that if I am in an accident and then you have to put me on a life support, then I do not want to be placed on a life support. So we have to respect that because it's an extraordinary means of sustaining life. So when we talk about extraordinary means, it means the means whether you have the means to, all right? Whether you are living in a sophisticated place where they have all the machineries. Imagine if you are in what you call that, before they used to call it the homelands and so on, where they didn't have the facilities. So if you go in villages in India and so on, they wouldn't have the sophisticated machinery and so on. So now what happens here is that the doctors do make the request, and tell us that, you should switch off the respirator, all right? But now my advice to them is that do not do that. Once the person is on the respirator, do not do it. And it will, inshallah ta'ala, make dua, and the person will end off. Allah will take the person away. And many a time it happened. I'm telling you my own, when they consulted me, they told my mother in the life support, the doctor said, must switch it off. We can only switch the machine if the person is brain stem dead. Now, it's not, you had a lecture last year on organ transplantation, so it's not, I'm not opening a can of worms here, but I just want to tell you that it's only then that you can switch off the respirator, but not when someone is still dependent for breathing, is still, needs that to be able to breathe. So we are not as Muslims allowed to do that. And I explained to you, once you don't, you can opt out of it, but once you're on it, then it's very difficult for you as a Muslim to switch it off, right? And unless the person is declared brain stem dead. Shukran.
Thank you. If we have any doctors in the audience that wish to take that specific question further, please come to the front and we can address that. We have another question from a student, I believe. So this is a young man that's just started his medical studies, am I correct? And this would be an interesting topic for him as well. Sorry, can we just put that mic on there?
Okay. This question is directed at Prof. Davidson, which specifically towards your organization and what they stand for. You said that the person has to be, one of the requirements is that they should be in a sane state of mind. Now, I would like to ask, building on the question that was asked previously, if this law is passed, and let's say everything taken into consideration, it is passed, now isn't it just a matter of time before we come to the argument where if a person is not in a sane state of mind and they had a living will before that they would not want to live like this, then what makes it that they shouldn't also terminate their own life? And I feel that just my personal opinion, and I don't know if this opinion is widespread, and I don't know if it's happening in Oregon at the moment, but I feel that's where the slippery slope can come into place. If we pass this law, immediately from this law, it won't be a problem. But then you'll have campaigns for euthanasia for other reasons, such as, let's say if a person is in end-stage Alzheimer's, and from there I feel that could lead to something else. So how do you feel we'll be able to tackle that if we do pass this law?
Thank you for that question. And maybe a rider to that question is it possible for someone to be in a sane state of mind when you are in extreme pain and extreme discomfort?
These are very complex issues. If you wrote a living will in a sane state of mind, that should stand. Yeah, I think that's the end of the story. The issue of Alzheimer's or dementia is very complex because that is not a terminal illness in most situations. Again, personally, I can see a case for Alzheimer's. If I had Alzheimer's, and you don't know your own family, you can be totally demented, I would prefer to die. But it's my choice. I'd imagine everyone in this room would disagree with me, but it's a personal choice. But certainly, in that state of mind, with Alzheimer's, I could not make that request and it should not be accepted. It would have to be written in a sane state of mind. Now, a living will in terms of a terminal illness, you're going to die. If you wrote that living will in a sane state of mind, it should stand, no matter what pain and lack of comprehension at the end. So if I write it today, if I am terminally ill, I would not like to live. I'd like to die a peaceful death with an overdose of morphine. That should stand, even if you can't get a comprehensive answer out of me when I'm terminally ill. This is my opinion. But of course, the criteria are a sane state of mind, and an independent panel assesses that and makes that decision. But you've stated the question, if you made the request before, and I think that should stand, yeah. It's your choice to make that request.
Thank you. Dr. Bray, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you very much for excellent presentations here this afternoon, for being at the Masjid. I would just like to indicate, give a little comment about the fact that the medical profession itself is very badly divided on the issue. Prof. Davidson would agree on that. And just to give you an indication, I was looking through Prof. John Ashton, the president of the UK's Faculty of Public Health, and a recent BMJ editorial, which clearly stated that all the necessary nursing care and procedures to undertake to relieve pain and suffering should be done. And if this is not doing any good to the patient, and if in the best interest it is necessary to shorten the end of this person's life, then he should perhaps be assisted in committing the termination of life. On the other hand, there is the British Medical Association, the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of GPs, and the majority of the doctors who responded to a poll in the UK, they all really opposed this procedure. My question to Professor is, pain and suffering cause severe depression, and which may be reversible to a degree, though the pain and suffering is continuing on, but treatment of the depression may lead to the point where a person who has initially agreed that I want to terminate my life may change the person's mind and may not want to die anymore. He may feel strong enough or well enough to combat or stand the pain and the suffering and carry on. This is something which has to be taken into consideration by, you mentioned the panel to do the assessment and come to a decision. I feel that whatever the panel decides to do, they must be taken into consideration. The second question is raising the question of termination of life, whether it comes from the family or friends or the physician or the patient himself. There is the strong likelihood that the person may feel that my pain and suffering is now becoming a burden to the family. Is that not likely to put further pressure to say yes to termination? Thank you.
Okay, again, there are many questions there. The last one, it's the individual's choice. But I'd like to touch first on your first point, the doctors. Doctors do help people to die. I'm sure there are many people here who have heard of it. They do it out of kindness and compassion when the patient is near the end and suffering. It's happened throughout the history of mankind. I doubt it's happening any more now. Maybe we hear about it a little bit more because were more open to talk about death today. Good on them. I've been criticised for even mentioning that because it puts the spotlight on the doctors and they don't like that publicity, and now they're going to stop doing it because they don't want to get caught because they're breaking the law. But let's change the law so the doctors are not breaking the law. Most importantly, on the subject of doctors, the patient needs to know if their doctor is going to help them at the end. The patient needs to know. At the moment, they're playing lotto with their doctor. Maybe she will help me, maybe she won't. If the law changes, the doctor will state, yes, I'm prepared to help a person to die or not. And you can choose your doctor. My mother's own GP said he would help her at the end. When the time came, he was gone, his tail between his legs. He wouldn't do it. And that's a risk patients run today. I am making an assumption that you know doctors who have done it, but they are there. I've heard it many, many times. I'm sure in your community too, out of compassion and kindness. I'm not sure the other part of the question. Pressure on the family, from the family, yes. The independent panel should take that into consideration. But again, it's choice. The person can change their mind. Even if they've been granted this assisted death, they don't have to take it up. Remember, a person can commit suicide anytime they want to, theoretically. They can go jump off a building, or whatever they do, terrible ways to die. The law only gives them an option of a peaceful death if they are terminally ill. They're near the end. And don't assume all people in this country have access to palliative care or hospitals. But if the law changes, they could have access to a peaceful death.
Thank you very much. Attorney Wahid Parker, question. Does the relationship between a patient and a doctor change significantly if this law were to be passed?
I'm trying to understand the dynamic of the doctor-patient relationship in terms of this legislation being passed. And I cannot see it changing because a doctor, in my view, would not be compelled or would be asked, who cannot be asked to perform or assist in the death of another person if he or she feels uncomfortable with it. So if you were to have a doctor and a patient who is now allowed to die, so to speak, I do not think that the situation before the bill being passed and after the bill being passed will change, because the doctor has the right at any stage to withdraw his participation in the act of euthanasia.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the ladies? Do the ladies have the roving mic upstairs? Yes? If you have any questions, please use that mic. I see we have a few doctors in the panel upstairs as well. Do we have a question on the side? I saw somebody's hand go up. Yes, please come to the front.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm a layman, but throughout the proceedings, I hear a lot of talk about challenging the law, and initially we had comment about what Islam says, what Muhammad ﷺ says, and it seems pretty clear-cut, and I know there's a lot of grey area, but from an Islamic perspective, I don't know how qualified the panel is from an Islamic perspective. There seems to be legal representation. I don't know all the brothers, but I think as a Muslim community, this is dangerous ground we are going into without having proper jurisprudence from Islamic perspective represented. So I don't know if there's any consensus in that, but it seemed pretty clear-cut there about the brother, the Sahabi, cutting his wrist, and what the implication of that is from his spiritual or his Dini aspect, and I think that is misrepresented here, or underrepresented.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes, we have Professor Ibrahim, who is more than qualified in the area of Islamic jurisprudence to answer any of the questions that you might pose. So maybe I want to pose this question. Was there a situation during the time of the Prophet where this specific topic was brought to the fore, and what the Prophet's answer was. If you can give us another example or two. I think of this question. Sheikh, is there anything from your side that you can inform us about? Come to the mic, please.
My respected Ustad, Professor Fadl, did make reference to it when he referred to the battle where the Sahabi actually threw himself into his sword because he couldn't stand the pain of his wound. And the Prophet ﷺ said that he is in hellfire, even though he was on the battlefield in jihad, supposed to die a shaheed. But the Prophet said his destination is the Jahannam because he took his own life. And I think our respected Sheikh is greatly capable of dealing with this issue. He is a professor, he is also an alim. Jazakallah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? We still have about 20 minutes before we conclude with our program. Any questions from the ladies upstairs? Yeah, we have a question. Please come to the mic.
Assalamu alaikum. It's at the attorney. On one of the slides earlier, it was mentioned something of the lethal injection. I would just like to know, we in countries and states where the death penalty is in effect, would that constitute assisted suicide or is it homicide?
Thank you.
Do I understand you correctly? The person is assisted and is given the injection. Am I correct? Well, that's murder. You're assisting the, well, it's called assisted suicide, but the bottom line is it's murder in its pure legal definition at present. You'll be charged with murder. Now, when you speak of, did you speak of countries overseas? Unfortunately, I don't know. You know, America has various states, and each state has its own jurisdiction and its own code. But from South African perspective, if you were to say to a person, yeah, go ahead. Was your question whether capital punishment would be applicable? Well, in South Africa, you know, it's outlawed. I mean, there's no capital punishment. I don't know, but in the states that capital punishment would be applicable, it wouldn't be a bar against that person being put to death. However, you know, whilst the law is operative, it does not mean that if you commit murder, you will die. It depends on the facts of the case at hand. But obviously, if he does that in an American state, and I presuppose, based on South African jurisprudence, that if that is what the case is there as it obtains here, then he could be put to death. Whether he will, I don't know. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Badruddin, please come to the front.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Shukran. The question is directed at Professor Ibrahim. I think the question that our brother earlier on posed in terms of this being an Islamic panel, maybe you could elaborate a little bit for us on what our options are in terms of Muslim law as to how we should be looking at this. Because I think maybe what he's implying is, in a sense, if Islam is so clear by saying suicide is completely haram, then what is the point of us even debating this in a mosque as a Muslim ummah? Because ultimately we are meant to look at Islamic law to determine our view on something like this. And I think maybe the answer for us lies somewhere in this gray area, whereby it seems clear that you are not allowed to actively take your own life, but at the same time, you are allowed to withhold treatment, which in effect means you are hastening your own death. So how does one tease that out a little bit, you know, for us as a Muslim audience?
Okay, I think it needs to be clarified, you're right. Our brother, perhaps this is what he was trying to to put forward, and it didn't come across rightly. Anyway, when we talk about whether we should have this type of discussion in a masjid, I think we should have this type of discussion in a masjid, because we all live in South Africa, all right? We do not live in a utopia where only Muslims are staying here. We read the newspapers, we know what happened to our brother, Professor Davison. You know, we have to be made aware of it. And the masjid is the place where we congregate, where we learn things. And I think that we should encourage these things to happen. We cannot stop that. You know, many a time we as Muslims, we feel that, you know, oh, we don't have to worry about all these things, it doesn't affect us. But it affects us, and as Doctor pointed out here. All right, so now the law, I think in 1990, our lawyer brother here pointed out that he started, but it didn't come to a conclusion, but now hopefully it will come. And we know about the abortion bill. It had been passed and so on. And we as Muslims, although it's there, we just, we wrote our, you know, objection to that, but we cannot do it. We are living in a non-Muslim country, and they are in majority. But we know our rights as Muslims, that even if it's legal in South Africa, it will be haram. So in the same way, when the euthanasia bill eventually goes into law, then we'll know that it is not allowed. But now, as far as the question of you see, unfortunately, we're using the English language, and then we're talking about euthanasia. They come with the term euthanasia, and they say there's voluntary euthanasia, then there's passive euthanasia, and there's active euthanasia. So that's why I try to use, okay, passive euthanasia is allowed. Okay? Now, the question that I was trying to say, that we have a right to refuse treatment. Right? A right to refuse treatment, and this happened in the last days of Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, if you remember, Sayyidina Abu Bakr and all were by him, and they were trying to put the medicine into his mouth, and he pushed it away, you know, trying to tell us that we have a right to. So now, medicine is not a cure. So there's a legal term which says, La darara wa la dirara fil Islam. You should not cause harm or harassment to the patient. So if the medicine, the medication, the chemotherapy, losing the hair, the side effects and all, it doesn't want to go through that, it's not a cure. You know? And I told you that ajal, the time at the point of death, is only known to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So no matter what you do, I mean, you have the right, within your right, not to take the medication, but you cannot starve yourself to death. You cannot starve. So that's why when we read about the Muslim prisoners starving themselves to death, it is haram. They're not allowed to do that. We are not allowed to starve ourselves to death. That's why we fast and we break our fast. And this is a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So again, and then when we talk about extraordinary means to sustain life, again, we have the option not to be put on the extraordinary means. Okay? Because we have to understand that if we don't have the means, of course, you will not go in a private hospital if you don't have money. First of all, they ask you to put the money forward. Now, you cannot put the whole family, your whole, progeny into, make them become destitute because just to try to put someone on a machine and drain all the resources, and then you have to put the house on mortgage, and so on, you know. So I think that we have to be relevant. And of course, it needs discussion, it needs more time to explain all that. We won't be able to do that or to do justice in the few minutes that we have. That's what I have to say. Shukran.
Thank you very much, Prof. We have time for 2 more questions. I've got one hand up here, and I have another hand up here, and now I've got 3 hands up. So we're running very tight on time. Please, precise questions so that we can get quick answers, and then we need to wrap up the discussion. And then Prof. Davison has also requested that he just wants to say a final word as well.
Shukran. I just wanted to raise a very important point in relation to this discussion today. I think it's not just an issue of Muslims disagreeing about euthanasia. The Christians, as well as the people of Scripture also have the same opinion and the same view in the fact that we do not disagree that you cannot take your life, but we say it is wrong to do so. And the reason for that is that God, who has given us life and who will determine the determination of the duration of that life, it is only Him in His infinite wisdom that can decide when that life will come to an end. I've just read something even in relation to Christian scripture, that pain and suffering, even Pope John Paul II has mentioned that pain and suffering is part of God's plan to cleanse the soul, to prepare it for God's grace. So I think there may be a perception that this is only maybe a Muslim thing, but both Muslims, devout Christians and Jews as well share the same opinion that euthanasia is against God's will.
Thank you very much. Yes, please do.
I feel I'm in the wrong audience to be talking about religious issues, but to me this is not a religious issue. I don't know what is in the Bible about euthanasia. I don't think it is mentioned. To me, this is an individual's choice between an individual and their own gods and their own conscience. The most important thing is the intention is about kindness. God is merciful. He forgives merciful acts. But at the same time, I agree, all these different religions don't support the taking of a life in any situation. So it's good to look for the answers within our churches, our mosques, our temples, because I believe the answers are there within our faiths that would support these acts of compassion. But I'm not a religious expert, I'm speaking from my heart.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see one of the ladies have a question upstairs. Can you please pose your question, and to who you're posing it to?
I don't think this thing is on.
It's on.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I just had a question. As a medical doctor working in a South African context, we work in the public sector where we often have to give advice to patients about withdrawal of care. So in terms of prognosing, I know Prof. Euthanasia mentioned that where your prognosis is bad or where there's terminal ill. But in our case, our decision to withdraw care is not just based on a medical prognosis, but also based on limited resources and your economical feasibility of maintaining that life. So often in an ICU setting in one of the children's hospitals here, we're faced with, do we use the fund to maintain a life that is potentially non-viable, or do you use that limited ventilator for someone who is potentially have a better prognosis? And we often have to make that decision about withdrawal of care and advising the families about withdrawal of care. So just some advice in terms of that, because of our South African setting is very difficult to prognose.
Thank you very much. As you can hear, ladies and gentlemen, deep moral and ethical dilemmas that our doctors are faced with. I think Dr. Baude wants to answer this question.
The advice to you would be that you discuss it with your colleagues, especially your senior colleagues, at least 2 other colleagues. Once you've taken that decision, you write it down so that you protect yourself. If down the line somebody wants to sue you, you've taken that decision, and you've taken a collective decision, and it's not your own decision. You've consulted your colleagues. So my suggestion is, not knowing the clinical situation, but you have consulted your colleagues, and obviously the family also, but to write down the decisions and who was there when the decision was taken to protect you.
Thank you very much. Please come to the front and pose your question.
No, it's not a question. I just want to make a few comments.
Certainly. Please use the mic.
Very much.
Professor, you can come to the front.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. I've been sitting here listening to this discussion, and I'm absolutely thrilled. And I'm thrilled because I feel that this is the true spirit of Islam.
I think for too long, Muslims have been considered people who don't get involved in intellectual debates. And I want to thank the committee here for having arranged such a meeting. Now, we Muslims have to engage with these issues. I had a recent discussion with a colleague of mine in Pakistan, a physicist by the name of Parvez Hoodboy, who told me that one day he was teaching his class, he's a physicist, the mechanics of an earthquake. And the class suddenly stood up and said, we don't want to listen to this. That earthquake happened in Iran or wherever because Allah willed it. Now that might be true. But there is a mechanic to an earthquake. There's a scientific explanation to it. And we, as Muslims, it's not haram for us to actually engage with that. Similarly, there was an imam in the Leytonstone Mosque in London who, on a Friday tarjuma, was telling his Jamaat that I read Darwinian evolution theory. They kicked him out of his job. They threw him out of his house. Now, that is not in the spirit of what Rasulullah wanted for his ummah. What Rasulullah said was, well, he was quoted to have said by a Jewish historian that an hour's contemplation of nature is worth more than 1,000 nights in prayer. And I think we need to remember that. Now, recently I was at a nikah in Durban, and somebody pulled me aside after the nikah, a cousin of mine, and he said, I've got something very serious to discuss with you. And I said, yes, please do. And he says, you know what, your pants is too long, your ankles are not showing. And I took him very seriously. I said to him, you know, Yaqub, right now there are Muslims dying in Palestine. Right now, over the years, we've had Iraq. Iraq invaded on the base of a lie because they wanted the oil. They said they were weapons of mass destruction. We Muslims are in such trouble. And do you think Allah at the moment is focusing on my ankles? So this is the point I'm making. As amusing as it sounds, these are very serious issues, and we need to engage with them. Now, Professor Davison, thank you very much for being here. I've read both your books very, very carefully. I attended your book launch at the Book Lounge, and you may not remember, but I got involved in the discussion there. I've been following this debate. I know of Lord Falconer's documents that came out of the House of Lords. This is not an easy matter, and it's come up over and over again in this discussion that this is a complex issue. And just calling it haram or not haram is not the point. I think the point is that Allah has given us the Holy Quran, right? He's also given us a brain. And he just didn't say switch the brain off and just read the Quran. He didn't say that at all. From what I gather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, use that brain. What is the mind for? So I'm glad that Professor Davidson has come and shared his afternoon with us. I have also been desperate reading about people with locked-in syndrome, or that editor of Elle magazine, who when he had his stroke, all he could do was just blink an eye. And through that he wrote a book talking about the desperate situation he found himself in and how welcome death would have been in that case. In America, there was a huge debate about a young lady. Her name was Terry Shivago, I think. And she was in a coma, I think, for about 18 years. Her parents didn't want her to die, but her husband felt that he couldn't bear to see his loving wife suffering. So these issues come up from time to time, and we have to deal with them. There are also cases of, just to make this point about how complicated this issue is, there are also cases of people who were written off as vegetables, who after a coma of 6 or 7 years suddenly came back to life and lived a normal life. So there is that issue to consider, that we might not always be correct when we diagnose somebody as absolutely terminally ill and a hopeless case, right? Now, I'm glad we made the distinctions here between assisted dying and patient-assisted dying and euthanasia. And Prof. Davidson, once again, I want to commend you on your bravery. If I were in your situation, instinctively I would have said, no, I can't do it. Right. And the other question that arises is, what if I want euthanasia and my family says, no, Daddy, we're not taking the responsibility of this because we have to live with the fact that we agreed to your death. So that's another issue to consider. Now, if I have a criticism of what Professor Davidson has done, and I know his situation was terribly, terribly difficult to watch a loved one suffer, but if I have a criticism, it's that he didn't do it within that medical legal structure, like they have in Oregon or like they have in Holland. In fact, Holland is going through a second upheaval because now they're considering whether to have euthanasia for children. So this problem just isn't going to go away. But the issue is that in Oregon, they have this structure, they have 2 independent medical experts, they have the family involvement, it's a whole process, and if they actually determine that this patient doesn't have 6 more months to live, and if this patient is allowed to live, the suffering is going to be unbearable, then we should consider that suicide. So there are these issues, and I think some of the questions that were raised here were very, very pertinent. And of course, there's that risk of abuse. Or of course, there's the risk of making the wrong decision. But ladies and gentlemen, when I get into my car and drive down the road, there's a risk. And that's a fact of life. Now, I'm not an Islamic scholar, and I think that point that was made was absolutely crucial. We in Cape Town or even in South Africa haven't heard from the Muslim scholars on this issue. Why are we silent on these issues? I remember at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, there were Muslims in denial that this won't happen in a Muslim community. We can't do that. We need to engage. And we need to be honest that we're human like everybody else. And like the Christian world had its upheaval with the abortion issue, we need to get involved with these issues. So we need those Islamic inspirations. And finally, and that's my final point, right? We need to take the bull by the horns, but we are on the right track. If we have more of these, I think we'll be doing wonderfully. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Professor Enver, for sharing those interesting thoughts and comments with us. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of the program. I see that we have a few hands up. Please engage our speakers after the seminar. Prof. Ibrahim might not be able to answer some of your questions. He's immediately leaving the masjid because his flight is at, I think, 4:30, so he's running a little bit late already. Thank you very much to each and everyone for attending today's program. To our guest speakers, thank you for coming to share your comments and your thoughts with us. Professor Davidson, thank you very much. I know that it's been an extremely difficult experience for you. Thank you for coming to present your thoughts with us. I'd like to call upon Brother Sattar Parker, who is the chairperson of the Trust Board, to do the vote of thanks and to present our guest speakers with a small token of appreciation from the mosque, as well as our sponsor for today's seminar, the Rondebosch Medical Center. Thank you very much on behalf of the mosque. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to the members of the panel, Professor Davison, Professor Ibrahim, and Wade Parker. Thank you very much to ETV. Thank you very much to the technical team headed by Siraj Parker. And also a very, very big thank you to the Rondebosch Medical Center. Dr. Ismail Sharif, you always come here and you always support our ventures. We thank you very, very much, and I'd like to wish you and your wonderful facility all the best for the future, inshallah. The first presentation we'd like to make is to Professor Davison. We have a silver coin, a commemorative coin of our mosque, as well as a book reflecting the 25-year history of this mosque.
Thank you. Our treasurer. Thank you.
Second presentation is to Professor Ibrahim. Thank you very much for coming. He came this morning. He'll be leaving this afternoon. May you have a salamat journey home, and all the best for the rest of Ramadan. And in advance, Eid Mubarak to you and the family. Attorney Wade Parker, second time around. First time was absolutely brilliant. Today, equally brilliant. Thank you so much. We highly appreciate it. Dr. Ismail Sharif, on behalf of the Imamate, the trustees, and the committee, a presentation to you. We hope that you will find it very interesting. And once again, thank you very much to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Parker, for those final remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. That brings us to the close of this program. The closing dua will be rendered by Sheikh Alexander, and thereafter we will break for Asr Salah. Thank you very much.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين اللهم افتح لنا بالخير واختم لنا بالخير واجعل عواقب أمورنا بالخير بيدك الخير والعافية إنك على كل شيء قدير وصلى الله على خير خلقه ونور عرشه سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب ما شاء الله شكرا